On January 2023, Lindsay Clancy, a Massachusetts labor and delivery nurse, killed her 3 young children in their family home. In the courtroom, there is absolutely no debate about these facts. The defense completely concedes that Lindsay committed these killings. The trial bypasses the question of who committed the crime, focusing instead on the psychiatric state of the person who did. The prosecution argues this was a calculated, deliberate act of murder. They point directly to the timeline of that evening, painting a picture of a woman who methodically orchestrated the conditions for her crimes under the cover of a quiet suburban evening. To execute this, they allege Lindsay intentionally created a specific window of opportunity. She sent her husband, Patrick, out of the house to run errands, asking him to pick up takeout from a local restaurant and grab medication from a nearby CVS. While he was gone, she executed her plan. The prosecution's strongest piece of behavioral evidence comes from the host at that restaurant, who testified that when Lindsay called to place her takeout order that evening, she sounded completely normal and entirely lucid. When a person sounds totally coherent just minutes before committing violence, it becomes incredibly difficult to convince a jury that they were experiencing a sudden, overwhelming loss of sanity. That chilling timeline of routine behavior creates a massive hurdle for the defense. To clear that hurdle, Lindsay's attorneys are pursuing a highly specific legal strategy. They are pleading not criminally responsible, often referred to as NCR, by reason of mental disease or defect. Massachusetts law requires a strict 2-pronged test for an insanity defense. They must prove a mental disease caused an inability to distinguish right from wrong, or an inability to control one's actions. The defense must prove she met one of these exact criteria when she harmed her children. In this trial, they focus heavily on the right side of this tree. To reach that threshold, they point to a well-documented diagnosis: severe postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is distinct from the more common baby blues or postpartum depression. It is a rare, severe medical emergency that occurs after childbirth, characterized by paranoia, hallucinations, and a total break from reality. This strict legal framework pivots the jury's task. They are no longer asked to simply punish a horrific crime. Instead, they have to evaluate the invisible, internal mechanics of a catastrophic mental break. The prosecution aggressively challenged the psychosis diagnosis. They argued that Lindsay manipulated her healthcare providers, sought quick medical fixes, and routinely failed to take her medication as prescribed. But the defense delivered a striking physical rebuttal right in the middle of the courtroom, bringing the evidence directly to Patrick Clancy during his testimony on the witness stand. Defense attorney Kevin Reddington approached Patrick and, one by one, presented multiple empty prescription bottles taken directly from Lindsay's bedside table. He used the physical containers to prove she was absolutely consuming the medication she was given. Through this cross-examination, the defense built a stark counter-narrative. Lindsay wasn't avoiding treatment or trying to game her doctors.
She was a deeply misdiagnosed patient, desperately searching for the right intervention for a rapidly escalating condition. The defense highlighted the sheer volume and chaotic complexity of the regimens doctors placed her on, noting she had been prescribed over a dozen different medications in the months prior to the tragedy. By walking the jury through this frantic medical timeline, the defense reframes the prosecution's theory of premeditation. From their perspective, the tragedy was the inevitable result of a healthcare system ill-equipped to treat a spiraling mother. The prosecution pushed back on the idea of an uncontrollable spiral. They pointed out that Lindsay had been left home alone with her kids several times in the weeks prior without incident, suggesting she was fully capable of functioning normally and simply chose to wait for that specific night. The defense countered by focusing on the medical reality of postpartum psychosis. It is a highly volatile condition. It rarely presents as a constant, steady state of visible mania. A person can rapidly cycle in and out of a severe psychotic state. The most compelling evidence for this volatility came from the prosecution's very first witness. Despite being called to build the case against his wife, Patrick Clancy's testimony ultimately became the defense's most powerful tool. Patrick has remained sympathetic throughout the proceedings. In both public statements and courtroom testimony, he characterizes Lindsay as a person who simply got sick, standing firm against the image of a calculating criminal. On the stand, he testified to a terrifying paradox. He recounted how Lindsay would confess to having intrusive thoughts of self-harm, yet be calmly making the kids lunch or getting them ready for bed just minutes later. The defense weaponizes this exact paradox to prove their core legal claim. If severe mental illness allows a mother to have violent thoughts one minute and make sandwiches the next, then sounding coherent on a phone call does not rule out the sudden onset of a psychotic break. The jury is facing an absolute binary decision with incredibly high stakes. If Lindsay Clancy is convicted of first-degree murder, she will face a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. A verdict of not criminally responsible brings its own specific set of legal mandates. An NCR verdict instantly triggers an indefinite civil commitment to a state mental health facility. She would remain locked in a medical institution until doctors and the court determine she is no longer a danger to herself or society. Beyond the walls of the courtroom, this trial has evolved into a painful national referendum on exactly how the justice system handles, prosecutes, and understands severe maternal mental health crises. It forces the public to confront a terrifying reality. Extreme, dangerous psychological illness does not always look outwardly erratic or frantic to the people watching. The tragedy of the Clancy family exposes a deadly, invisible gap. It highlights the vast space between a medical system failing to diagnose postpartum psychosis and the sudden, devastating moment a person loses the ability to control their own actions. Lindsay Clancy was a labor and delivery nurse who, by all accounts, was a dedicated mother. She even named her first daughter after the first baby she ever delivered at Massachusetts General Hospital. But on a Tuesday evening in January 2023, she strangled her 3 young children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. The act left her community searching for answers in the wake of an incomprehensible tragedy. The medical explanation at the center of the subsequent murder trial is a rare and severe condition, postpartum psychosis. This condition is distinct from more common struggles. While many new mothers experience the mild baby blues or the persistent weight of postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis represents a sharp, dangerous spike into a different category. It is a psychiatric emergency defined by hallucinations, paranoia, and intrusive thoughts. At first, the disease lives entirely inside the mind. It creates a silent psychological vacuum, turning a mother into a prisoner of her own delusions before any outward signs of lethal danger appear. For Lindsay's husband, Patrick Clancy, the weeks leading up to that night were a descent into total uncertainty as he tried to manage his wife's increasingly erratic mental state. During his testimony, Patrick described a medical crisis that was terrifyingly unpredictable. The family lived through a constant cycle of psychological extremes. Lindsay would confess to having dark, intrusive thoughts of harming the children, but minutes later she would appear entirely stable, making lunch, playing with the kids, and following the family's normal evening routine. When Patrick asked if she needed to be kept away from the children for their safety, Lindsay told him she didn't. This unpredictability is what makes the condition so dangerous for families. The fleeting moments of normalcy act as a mask, hiding a catastrophic medical crisis from the people most capable of intervening. The Clancys spent months searching for professional help. They visited emergency rooms and secured admissions to top psychiatric facilities, yet the medical system never provided a stable solution. This period is a point of contention in the trial. Prosecutors argue that Lindsay manipulated her healthcare providers, seeking quick fixes and withholding information when she didn't like a specific treatment plan. The defense presents this same timeline as evidence of a woman in distress. They argue Lindsay was trapped in a cycle of mismedication, attempting to abandon drugs that failed her while searching for any treatment that could stop her symptoms. According to the defense, the system failed because healthcare providers lacked the specific training required to recognize the red flags of postpartum psychosis before it reached a breaking point. Prosecutors push back by focusing on the day of the killings. They point to witnesses who claim Lindsay sounded entirely rational when she ordered takeout on the phone just hours before the children were killed. Without a clear, definitive diagnosis, families are left to manage acute psychiatric emergencies on their own, shifting a life or death burden onto spouses who are entirely unequipped to handle it. On January 24th, Patrick Clancy returned from running errands to a house that was disturbingly quiet. He found Lindsay in the backyard, severely injured from a suicide attempt. He immediately called 911, describing her injuries to the dispatcher while searching for the rest of his family. The 911 call captures the moment Patrick entered the basement and found his children. His voice breaks into wailing as he realizes they have been strangled, telling the operator, "She killed the kids." Even after the tragedy, Patrick has called for public forgiveness, maintaining that his wife had been entirely overtaken by a severe illness. When this illness goes untreated, the terminal stage inflicts a permanent, shattering trauma on the surviving spouse. Patrick is left to process the loss of his children and the disappearance of the woman he loved. The trial highlights a massive friction point, the attempt to judge a complex medical crisis within the rigid framework of criminal law. In Massachusetts, the test for criminal responsibility is binary. A jury must determine if the defendant knew right from wrong at the time. As the flowchart expands, we see the second prong. Did a mental defect make them unable to control their own actions? This forces two opposing narratives. One describes a woman who planned a calculated, premeditated act. The other describes a mother who loved her children but was consumed by a biological defect in her brain.
The justice system often struggles with maternal mental health crises, as it attempts to fit a nuanced medical tragedy into a polarized battle of guilt versus insanity. The emotional weight inside the courtroom has been immense. The judge has had to instruct the jury to set aside their natural sympathy and horror to focus strictly on the evidence. That trauma became physical during the proceedings. After the 911 call was played, a juror suffered a severe anxiety attack, requiring paramedics to be called to the courthouse. Beyond the courtroom, the case has split the community. Mothers across the country have engaged in heated debates, often projecting their own experiences with postpartum health onto the evidence. If you or someone you know is struggling, there are resources available right now. You can contact the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988 or the National Maternal Mental Health Hotline at 1-833-TLC-MAMA. Postpartum psychosis is a preventable medical crisis, but when it remains unrecognized, it acts like a bomb, destroying a family and radiating trauma through the healthcare system, the courts, and the community at large. A husband returns home from picking up takeout dinner and running errands. Moments later, he makes a 911 call. The operator hears a father shrieking, discovering one by one that his 3 young children are gone. The physical facts of that January night in Duxbury, Massachusetts, are completely undisputed. A mother strangled her 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan, before attempting to take her own life. Because the defense concedes she committed the act, the resulting legal battle isn't about who did this. It's entirely focused on why. To answer that, the jury has to unravel her state of mind at the exact moment she went down into the basement. Looking for a motive in this case forces us to look past the crime scene. It pulls us directly into one of the most complex and poorly understood corners of modern healthcare: psychiatric intervention for mothers in crisis. The defendant facing 3 charges of first-degree murder is Lindsay Clancy. Before the trial, she worked as a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. She named her firstborn daughter after the very first baby she ever delivered there. She spent her career caring for new mothers and infants, only to be swallowed up by a maternal health tragedy of her own. A series of prescription pill bottles found on her bedside table serve as the primary physical evidence for the conflict in this trial. For the prosecution, those bottles tell a story of a woman who acted intentionally and rationally. They argue she manipulated her medication schedules to carry out a calculated goal. The defense looks at those exact same bottles and sees a deeply sick patient. They argue she was suffering from an undiagnosed psychotic break, dangerously overmedicated by a healthcare system failing to properly treat her. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution lays out a timeline intended to prove she was of sound mind. Their strategy relies on characterizing her as a patient who was doctor shopping. They claim she sought out easy prescriptions whenever she felt anxious about returning to work, rather than engaging in a consistent treatment plan. They point to partially empty pill bottles found in her home to allege she was intentionally skipping doses, withholding her compliance from the medical professionals trying to help her. They also highlight a specific instance a few months before the killings, when she went to South Shore Hospital after being awake for 48 hours. They allege that while describing her symptoms, she deliberately withheld the fact that she had taken a marijuana gummy. By pointing to omissions like that hospital visit, prosecutors are painting a picture of someone who is calculating and deceitful, rather than incapacitated. This entire theory of guilt depends on the jury interpreting her medical inconsistencies as deliberate, malicious choices. But the defense offers a completely different explanation: postpartum psychosis. This is a severe mental health emergency that can emerge shortly after giving birth, characterized by intense hallucinations, deep paranoia, and violent, intrusive thoughts. The tragedy is that postpartum psychosis is notoriously difficult to diagnose. Many general healthcare providers lack the specialized, advanced training necessary to spot the red flags before a patient's condition escalates. The jury heard testimony from her ex-husband, Patrick, describing their desperate attempts to get her help. He detailed the massive volume of drugs she was taking, over a dozen different medications prescribed by various doctors in a very short period of time. Patrick clarified a crucial detail on the stand: she wasn't trying to abandon her treatment. Instead, she was actively trying to get off specific drugs, like benzodiazepines, and antipsychotics like Seroquel. She could tell these medications weren't working, and was trying to communicate that to her doctors. This perspective frames her journey as a pharmacological trial and error, driven by a patient desperate to find a treatment that actually worked. Patients experiencing severe mental illnesses often have moments of apparent lucidity. A person might articulate dark, intrusive thoughts, and then, minutes later, seamlessly go back to making lunch or playing with their kids. This whiplash confuses families and masks the severity of the psychotic break. This diagram illustrates the diagnosis gap. Without a clear underlying diagnosis like psychosis, doctors prescribe medications targeting surface-level symptoms like anxiety. Over time, layering these prescriptions creates a tangled web of chemical interactions, while the root cause continues to grow. When a patient is buried under this dizzying complexity of overlapping medications, it becomes incredibly difficult for the legal system to determine exactly what their true state of mind was at the time a crime occurred. The conflicting interpretations of these prescriptions suggest that even within the medical community, the path to a correct diagnosis for material psychosis is often unclear. Whether a jury ultimately holds her criminally responsible or civilly commits her to a state mental health facility, the facts of this trial reveal a massive vulnerability in how we handle maternal health care. We often want to view psychiatric medicine as a guaranteed cure, but prescribing for the brain is a highly precarious, imprecise science. Preventing the next tragedy requires looking closely at how we equip medical professionals to recognize the red flags of severe maternal mental illness before it's too late. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, contact the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing or texting 988. If you're pregnant or have just had a baby and need support, you can call or text the National Maternal Mental Health Hotline at 1-833-TLC-MAMA.